Welcome to consumergoodsanalytics.com. My name is Santiago Restrepo, and today I'll be sharing a case study on a new product introduction. So how to determine the best new product launch strategy based on a target consumer profile. We'll start with some background, and basically we have a consumer goods manufacturer or retailer who's planning to launch a new consumer electronics product. And the product has the following characteristics. It's designed for a tech-savvy consumer. It's a prestige brand name, and now it's also an upscale product that's a little bit more expensive than similar products out in the marketplace. So a common approach of launching this type of product is to place it in most of the stores or all the stores or where there is space available. Some more advanced techniques look at demographic traits of the stores and place the stores, for example, where there are more consumers with a higher income. But the optimal approach is to use a consumer segmentation schema and determine the potential of every store based on the consumers that live around that stores. And we'll showcase how to implement that methodology here. So a consumer segmentation schema is a system that classifies each US household into one of multiple segments. Here we're seeing a segmentation schema that has around 170 segments, and we know exactly how many households belong to each of the segments, as well as many demographic characteristics and behaviors of each of those specific segments. So let's take a look here at segment 14. Which they're middle age without children, they're urban, and we can see the index on each of the demographic characteristics, and we can also see what are the main behaviors of that specific segment. So we can see where are they located, what are the main zip codes in the US, and we can also see what are the different demographics and lifestyles. So that specific segment, for example, index says high on being a member of an art association, and they index high on doing sports and fitness, yoga. So there's a lot of information about each of those segments. They index high, for example, on drinking Irish whiskey, and they index low, for example, on using cigarettes that have menthol, for example. Let's look at other examples. Let's look at one of the segments here in the right side, which are the ones that are least affluent. Let's look, for example, at this segment 141, and we see that they're middle-aged with children, renters, low income, highly indexed to be Black or African American. And we can also see where that specific segment is located and what are the key characteristics. So we see what are the main zip codes and the low zip codes for that specific segment, and we can also see again what are the different things that they do. So sports and fitness, they play a lot of basketball, they don't play a lot of golf or own their snow skis. For example, they index high on using men's sweats, but they index low on using men's swimsuits. So we can see a lot of the different characteristics for each of these specific segments. So now we're going to look at the specific segments and where they're located. And as an example, we're going to look at New York City, but I want to give you a caution here that the next map that you're going to see has a lot of pie charts, and pie charts are not the best way to represent information visually, but I have not been able to find another way that's better. If you have suggestions, I'd love to hear them. Please let me know. But I think pie charts do a decent job in representing what I want to show in the next visualization and example. So here is the New York City area. We have one pie chart for every block group, and every pie chart represents the number of consumers that belong to each of the segments. So let's clean this up a little bit and just select the top segments in the New York City area. We don't need to see 172 slices per pie chart. If we just look at the top pie charts, we see that around the Central Park area, which is the nicest, one of the nicest area in New York, the main segment is this blue segment that's called segment 46. Let's look at who they are and what they like doing. So that segment 46, they're middle-aged, renters, they're affluent, they index high on being Asian. And let's look at an entertainment and leisure perspective, what they like doing. So they like attending the regular season of the NBA. They don't follow a lot of NASCAR. So those are some of the characteristics that are important for this segment. In the banking area, they have saving accounts, and they index pretty low on having non-interest bearing checking accounts at a credit union. And there's a lot of different characteristics about this segment. Let's take a look, for example, at their media preference. Let's say the print media preference. So we see, for example, the magazines that they read. They read the New Yorker, but they don't read TV Guide or Reader's Digest and so forth. So from what we know about these segments and these young people living in New York, I feel it's all pretty accurate information. Now let's look at another top segment in New York, and let's look at the area towards the north, which is not the nicest part of town, and the main segment there seems to be the yellow one, which is segment 146. Let's see who they are and what they like doing. So segment 146, they're older, without children, renters, have low income, and they index pretty high on being Hispanic and African American. And let's see, for example, in the media side, what they like doing. So they index pretty high on reading Johnson Publishing. They index low on reading magazines that talk about intermedia outdoor group. Let's look at newspapers. They index pretty low on reading the New York Times. So that from a print media perspective. Let's look at their lifestyle characteristics. And so, for example, they index very high on being members of a church board, and they index low on being members of an art association for a museum or symphony. So from what we know and what we understand of these segments that live in the northern part of New York, it seems pretty accurate information to who they are and what behaviors and they have. So now let's take a look at different zip codes, and there's a zip code that we're all very familiar with, which is the zip code 90210, which is Beverly Hills. And what we envision in that zip code is people, or are people that are very wealthy, and this is what we're seeing here. Most of the top segments are here in the top side of the chart, which are the segments from number 2 to number 48, and we see that they're affluent and high income, and that's pretty accurate to what we know of the Beverly Hills zip code. Now, if we're familiar with Beverly Hills, we also know that in the southeastern part, it's not as nice, and the people that live around that area are not as affluent, and that's what the information is reflecting for us. So that's another proof that the consumer segmentation schemas are very precise in describing who the segments are and where exactly they live and how to reach them. And we're going to show some other great examples on how to leverage that information. First step in the process is developing or getting a profile for a specific product or behavior. So we're going to do this analysis for a specific product, which is a consumer electronics product designed for a tech-savvy consumer. It's a prestige brand and it's an upscale product. So you can imagine what product I'm talking about, but I'm not going to disclose the exact brand or the exact product. But for the purpose of this case, the information I'm providing here is good enough. So basically, the index shows the propensity of each of the segments to buy that specific product. So we see that the number one segment here is segment 101, which are middle income urban younger renters with and without children. And they are 9 times as likely as the average US household to purchase that specific product. But there's not everybody is young. Other people, some that are middle aged, like segment 36, they're also indexed pretty high on that specific product. And there are other segments that index pretty low on that specific product. There are segments that have an index of 0, and so it's very unlikely that they purchase that specific product. So the consumer profile is a key ingredient, and it's a starting point to developing a lot of the consumer segmentation schema analysis. So we have here 3 sample stores of these retailers, and we draw a radius. In this case, it's a 5-mile radius, and see how many households live around each of the stores. So this store here is in the middle of Manhattan. A lot of people, so there's around 1 million households around the 5-mile radius. While this store here is outside of the city in the suburbs, and there's around 75,000 people that live there. So we basically need to do that for each one of the stores. We are showing that here to you visually, but in order to do the analysis for hundreds of stores with the overlapping circles, you're going to need to use a GIS tool, or Geographical Information System. And here's an example of one, and here's an example of how we have multiple stores, and that system helps us calculate the population within a specific radius. In this case, we use a 5-mile radius. So as a next step in the trade area definition, we look at the population within 5 miles for each of the stores, and we do a quartile analysis. So the stores that are in the upper quartile, that are there's a lot of people around them, we're going to use only a smaller radius as a trade area, a 3-mile radius. And for the stores that are more rural, there's not that many people around them, we're going to use a larger area, a 50-mile radius. Usually in areas that are more rural, people travel more to go to their specific stores. And then somewhere in between, we're going to use also 5-mile radius and 10-mile radius. So that's how we are going to define the trade radius for each of our stores. As a next step, we're going to use that same trade area to look at each of the stores and see what are the type of consumers that live there. So the same 3 stores number 27, we see that a lot of the segments that live there are the green and the blue. Store number 9, we see that there's also different segments, P57, K38, in P58, and we look here at store number 129, has a lot less consumers around it, but we can see the composition of consumers that live around that store. Now we were just showing that to you visually, but in order to do this for hundreds or thousands of stores, again, you're going to need to use a geographical information system, because the trade areas are a special tool to run this algorithm and be able to determine the store composition of consumers around them. Now let's look at the store indexes and explain how they work. So this is the profile of the product that we looked in the previous step, where the number one segment was A6 and there were other strong segments here in the middle. And then here we have the number of households in each of the three stores that we analyzed visually, and we saw how each of those stores had a composition of customers. So let's rank and sort the product index from the higher index to the lower index and see how each of the stores compare. So the first store, 5 and A6, so that store has a pretty good correlation or pretty good fit with the profile. So the store index is gonna be pretty high in this case. It's gonna be 311. The second store, most of the segments are here towards the middle of the profile, so it's gonna be an average store. The index is 101. While this store here, 151, most of the customers are here in segments that are very low on the index of the product. So the store index is gonna be low for that specific store. It's gonna be 64 in this case. So this is a pretty good way visually to see how the indexes work and see the right fit between the store and the profile of the product. Now let's look at how the indexes are calculated because there's some math behind it, and we calculate the index for those same three stores here. And basically what we do is we know the index of the segment for the product, we know the household count in the tried area, and what we do is a weighted average. So we multiply the index times the number of households. We see that's the total in that specific store for the index times the number of households. And then we calculate the trade area, number of households, which is the total of this column. And then we just do a ratio of those two columns and get to the specific index. So you can try the calculations yourself and see how this works. And you can do this math using thousands of stores, and you can very easily calculate the index for each of those stores. So the next step is to do some validation based on what we know of the consumers and what we know of the area where we live. We can create a heat map of the whole US and see which are the areas that index high towards that product or low towards that product. So if we zoom into New York City, we can see that the best areas for launching this new product are going to be here in downtown Manhattan. Here in Bronx, it's not going to be good for it. And here towards the east, now it gets better. So you can compare what you know of the consumer, the product you're trying to launch with, and be able to see if the methodology provides accurate results or not. So it's a good way to validate it. And also, if you want to see in the whole USA areas that have an index of more than 100, then you can just change your filter and it's going to show you exactly which zip codes in the US are the ones that are a good fit with this product. Another step in the validation process is to look at the details of a market. So here we're going to look at, for example, New York, and we're going to compare the index of each of the stores versus the index of the surrounding zip codes. So we see here that the stores in downtown Manhattan index pretty high, and the surrounding zip codes have a pretty high index that's a pretty dark orange. And we see some of the other stores that index pretty low. For example, this store here in New Haven, Milford, Connecticut, index is pretty low, and we see that the surrounding zip codes index pretty low. They're more towards the blue side, even what type of people live in what areas. So the last step in the process is to determine your selection strategy. Our recommendation for this step is to look at other step in the validation process is to look at the details of a market. So here we're going to look at, for example, New York, and we're going to compare the index of each of the stores versus the index of the surrounding zip codes. So we see here that the stores in downtown Manhattan index pretty high, and the surrounding zip codes have a pretty high index that's a pretty dark orange. And we see some of the other stores that index pretty low. For example, this store here in New Haven, Milford, Connecticut, index is pretty low, and we see that the surrounding zip codes index pretty low. They're more towards the blue side. So that's a great way to validate based on your knowledge of where you live or areas in the country that you're familiar with. You can see if the product is a good fit based on your understanding of where consumers live and what type of people live in what areas. So the last step in the process is to determine your selection strategy. Our recommendation for this step is to look at the index of each of the stores, but also the households that live around each of the stores. There are some of the stores that have a great index, but there's very few people living around them, so we don't recommend putting a lot of effort to launch a new product in this store. But the stores that have a high population and a high index are the best ones to launch the product. So in this case, stores that are priority A, and then the B would be good as well, and so forth. So based on your budget, your objectives for the launch, and what you want to do, you can determine your strategy. Here in this case, we're recommending that stores that have high priority just launch the product with a lot of support and end caps and training. For stores B, do a softer launch, and for C as well with fewer facings, and maybe for store D, don't launch the product at all. But that's just a suggestion. You are the experts on your business, and you know and understand your budgets and your targets for your product launch. So you can determine the launch strategy based on this approach. So that's all for today. Please go to our website, consumergoodsanalytics.com, for a lot of great information, more details on this case study and other case studies, articles, and examples of advanced visualization. And remember, if you're not doing these types of analytics, your competitors probably are.